all C-15 does is say that the UN Declaration applies in Canada. It says that Canada should undertake a review of all its laws and policies to ensure they conform with the standards in the UN Declaration. It sets out a requirement to do a national action plan. And then it says Canada has to report back to Parliament in order to sort of say what they're doing. And then finally, it clarifies that nothing in implementing or nothing in C-15 can abrogate or derogate, which is take away or undermine or impact existing rights.
This is the Gomaluku podcast.
Yeah, because you got some. Well, obviously, what was it like promoted to full professor?
Yeah,
That's awesome. At least that I assume that's awesome. Otherwise,
I think so. It just means that I've done a lot of work in recognition. I got sort of a bump in title.
I got. What did you get? Well, I got a title bump. That's
Yeah.
pretty much it. But
I mean, there's a touch more money, but like in academia, no one's getting rich. So it's,
yeah, but it is. Well, I've never aspired to be an academic. However, like, maybe it's because I don't understand the world as much as I should be, actually, because I see there's a lot of academia in the movement. There's a lot, like at the UN, there's a lot of academics. So in a way, there is some benefit to it. But I'm just glad that there are academics out there that love to do the work. I love to do what they do. So that I don't have to do it, because
yeah, it's something that gives us, I think one of the reasons why you can see a lot of academics involved is just because the freedom that we get to sort of set our own schedules and agendas, right? So it allows, so my participation, I can always count as part of my research, as long as I'm writing academic articles and stuff resulting from it, I can kind of stem all of that.
Right. Yeah, because I do see some like the craziest thing that I do is when there's actually a call for submissions from Print Forum or mostly MREP, and I go through the submissions, then your name is usually in between those submissions, right?
Yeah, when I can find the time, but yeah.
So like, I don't know, it's I'm fascinated by the amount of pieces that you put out into the documentation and articles and opinions. That like I don't know, maybe it is because I suck at writing, and think that that's what it is for me, that I very much envy people like yourself, doing what you do, actually.
Well, thank you. Yeah, writing is definitely the toughest part of the job. I think some people are natural writers, and some things are just easier to write than others, right? So the thing that I've learned over the last 10 or 15 years that I've been doing academia is stuff that and stuff you're interested in and passionate about is easier to write about, right? So the projects that I'm excited about that I come up with on my own, that are things I want to do, it's easier to sit down and just write. And some of the UN submissions, when I can find time, because they're really short little pieces, right? No one needs a 60-page submission on, whatever the study is, when the UN can max out at, what is it, 20 or 24 pages or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So you're trying to make one little point in sort of a 5-page brief. And
right. Yeah, and I hope, well, based on what your opinions that you publish, as well as everything else that you do, because I love your thoughts about FPIC 100%, and I also read your document on it. And did you actually also contribute to the call for studies for the self-determination report on the MREP?
No, because I worked with Celeste McKay to plan the expert seminar.
Okay, so you already contributed in that way.
Yeah, and Holly wasn't in daycare for a good chunk of January, so
Right.
I had teaching in this seminar to do, and so finding the time, I would have liked to, but I've written a couple of journal articles on it, but
Yeah.
yeah, no time, no time.
Wow. Yeah, it is. I'm so. I think we already started this whole conversation. Actually, I don't know. Like, I should say, like, all right, we'll start, and then we'll start from scratch. But I think, well, this is how I usually roll. Actually, this is a conversation, not necessarily an interview. Um, so yeah, are you man? Yeah, all right. Let's just start before I ask you the good questions, and then whereas I'm already super fascinated by everything, actually, particularly like how you your yeah, how should I say it, like you the road that you've traveled, actually, um in your how you developed your interest. I think that is also super interesting. Actually, when I told my humble community that I was that had you on a podcast, they were super excited.
Oh,
um so you do, I'm sure you have fans out there. I'm sure, but apparently within people that watch and listen to the podcast, like people, you're also super interested, and definitely what's on the table right now, Bill C-15 in Canada. They'd love to hear your thoughts about it. But I think, yeah, I always love to talk about, like, listen to like origin stories of people. The like the comical episode 1 of Brenda Gunn. I think that would be super interesting to kick off the conversation with.
sure.
So that people know who Brenda is.
I don't think it's a very interesting story, and but I'm happy to share whatever I can about how I've tripped into this life.
Mhm. Yeah.
So,
So let's start. You're full blown professor right now. I think you did a tweet, Facebook post, April 1st. I think that was it, like that, when you're fully fledged professor. So 100% congratulations
thank you.
on that achievement. Obviously, uh, yeah. How big of a role did education play in your life? Um,
Yeah,
that it actually culminated into this, yeah, being a fully fledged professor at this point.
sure. You know, I think um, I kind of never would have thought that I was going to end up in academia or as a professor, and getting to be a full professor at the time that I did wasn't sort of anything that I foresaw, but it kind of just little step by little step. So, you know, you get asked about this more and more. And as I think about it, I just remember even in high school, so years sort of 10, 11, 12 in school, starting to get really interested in social justice issues and getting more political. My sister, who's about 5 years older than me, was in university and getting involved with some of the women's movements and things like that. And yeah, so I remember becoming more politically aware at that age. And then when I went to university, I went to a small town in Alberta, Canada first. And it was a shocking experience. It was such a different world. Alberta is known to be, I think, quite conservative.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it was a sort of more Christian based school that I went to. And like the racism that I just was so more blatant than I had experienced growing up in Winnipeg, even though people, at one point we had the title of being the most racist city in Canada. Um, it was really blatant. the things that I was hearing, and it just I only made it a year there. I decided it wasn't the university for me, and I moved back home to Manitoba. And then I started doing women's studies and Native studies because I wanted to really get a good understanding of and be able to articulate and fight against all the injustice and things that I was experiencing and hearing. Um, and so, yeah, I did a Bachelor of Arts degree at the University of Manitoba. And as I was working through that degree, it was like, wow, the law is really problematic. Like a lot of the sort of basis of the racism and discrimination in Canada has really been entrenched in law. So then it was like, well, if you want to fight the system and if law is the problem, then you go to law school. So I had a friend who was a year ahead of me in law school, and she was going, or sorry, a year ahead of me in undergrad, and she was going to law school. So I said, hey, how do you, like, you're going to law school. I want to go to law school. How do you do this? And so she said, well, you have to write the LSAT. And I was like, well, what is this? And she explained it was an admissions test that you had to write. And so I figured out, looked on, figured out how to do that, got a study book. This was kind of before the online time, and got a book, and I studied, wrote the test, and then applied to a bunch of law schools. Decided to go to Toronto, Canada for law school. In part because two of my best friends had already moved there for grad school. So my reason for picking the University of Toronto for law school wasn't necessarily grounded in anything other than my friends already moved to Toronto. Toronto sounded like fun. And there's two law schools. One is more downtown and one is more in the suburbs. And I decided I didn't want to long commute to law school. So I went to the one downtown, and then turns out the University of Toronto claims to be a very good law school in Canada. And while there were a lot of challenges there, I had some amazing opportunities. And so, every little step just took me along the way. And at University of Toronto, there was what were they calling it? A human rights internship that you could do in the summertime. And so I decided I would apply for one of these internships, and I ended up in Australia. And I ended up, because one of my professors knew someone working there, so I ended up working at the UNSW, and I met Megan Davis there. And Megan and I became fast friends, and she introduced me to the work she was doing internationally at that time. This was around 2002 or 2003, so the UN Permanent Forum was just getting going. We were in the final stages of the UN Declaration negotiations, at least at the working group on the draft deck. And yeah, and so then from there, I just kind of step by step, I finished my law degree and decided I wanted to do more of the international stuff. And well, if you want to do international Indigenous rights stuff, where do you go but Arizona, right? So I went down to the University of Arizona, and I worked with Jim and Aya, and I met Rob Williams and James Hopkins and the people there. And working with Jim, I was like, I need to learn Spanish to do this work because there's a lot of really important stuff happening in Latin America. And so I then found, I came back to Canada and finished doing my articling so I could become a lawyer. And during that time, I decided I should try to pursue opportunities to keep doing this work on Indigenous international rights, learn some Spanish. So I found an internship in Guatemala, and I went down to work at a human rights clinic in Guatemala in a small town called Rabinal. And they were bringing some claims of genocide to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. And it was still at the commission. Yeah, they hadn't moved to the court yet. It was still at the commission stage, I think. And I thought I was going down there to learn, but turns out the lawyer who was working on the case was a Guatemalan civil lawyer. And so she didn't actually know a lot about the international system other than another community had succeeded. So they were trying. So I provided a lot of support for that case, just sort of strategic how to bring the case and that sort of stuff. And then, so just kind of step by step. And then I moved back to Canada and, I don't know, and eventually got a job at the University of Manitoba when I moved back home to Winnipeg after I decided I was done in Toronto and wanting to be back home closer to home, and got my job, and then just been at U of M since 2009. That's my wandering story. There was no plan.
But it's an interesting one. As in like you make a choice and you just I'm always fascinated by people's path, like from the point where they decide. So like, for example, in your case, all right, yeah, I'll just go to Toronto because my friends are over there as well. And then look at where you end up right now. I'm not saying that you end up, this is the point where you are, that's the final destination. That's not what I'm saying, not what I'm saying. However, that I'm super fascinated by that, by the choices that we make, the people that we meet, the work that we do, and how that shapes us in a way, and not just ourselves, but also our path. I'm always super fascinated by that. And just saying that because you could have easily gone to, I don't know, Vancouver or Ottawa or something else, and it could have been totally different.
Totally different. It is really funny. And I remember like in my first year of law school, I met a friend and he was kind of like, what's your 7-year plan? I was like, make it through first year law school without like quitting, because there was many times that I almost walked away. And so I've never been, I think I'm better now at having longer term plans, but it's kind of like, I don't know, you finish up this year, finish this project, and then sort of see what's next.
Is there ever a law student out there, at least when you went to law school, that actually did have a plan, like a 7 or 8 year plan?
I think so. And I don't know if it's fair to say, but there are people who definitely go to law school, at least in Canada, that are coming from very privileged positions. Their parents may be lawyers or partners in major firms, and like they sort of set out from a young age to know their lawyer, that they're going to be lawyers and doing sort of the work, and they just kind of set out on the path. And I don't know if that's good, right? Like I had no focus on a path. I just kind of let myself get tripped into this and that, and kind of enjoyed it. I've had a pretty fun time of it, and then being open to all those different things has been really great. It's been really stressful at points when you don't know where the next job is, or those sorts of things. But I definitely think a combination in law school of people, like I just didn't even know what being a lawyer was, right? No one in my family had ever gone to law school. The only people who had engaged lawyers were those who had troubles with the criminal justice system, right? Or maybe some family lawyers, or for some, I don't know if anyone's really been divorced, or I'm sure some family members have used a lawyer to write a will. My parents had a will at some point when I was a young kid, right? So they probably engaged some sort of lawyer, but I had no idea what I was doing, and no one who could help direct me or guide me or sort of figure out. So there was no way I could make a 5 to 10 year plan, because I didn't know how it worked, right? It was only once I was in law school that then I realized you had to do this thing called articling, right? So then it's like, oh, I guess I have to figure out some place to article. And and I found mentors along the way and people who could help me. Megan was really, once I met Megan, she was really helpful in getting me involved and introducing me to some people. And I remember talking to Paul Joff at one point when I was in law school with the Cafe Serpentine. At one point I was like, Paul, I have to article, what should I do? And I want to article in Indigenous rights, and there's no articling positions on this. And his advice was just take any articles you can so you can become a lawyer, and then you can decide what kind of work you want to do, right? So you have sort of little people that help you along the way. But if you don't know what this life is, how do you make a 10-year plan on it, right? Like I had no ability to sort of foresee how to do any of this work, because I was kind of charting my own path.
Was it easy for you to ask people like Paul Joff for help or guidance?
No. I think it's always been really hard to ask for support and guidance. I'm getting better at it now, but it's just like little moments of courage, right? And little bits of time, right? So like people who are bolder than myself might have been like, hey, Paul, can can I article with you, or can we make, right? Like, and I would have never had that sort of courage, but like, I have this one little decision. Can you give me some feedback on like how to help me figure out this next little step? And so, yeah, trying to find the people that you can ask those little things for.
Right. Yeah, because just for me personally, I always get starstruck, like with people. Even asking people for the podcast, like oh, why in the world would they want to let alone be on my podcast, let alone like, I don't know, give me advice or anything. So I have to like ease into a conversation like over coffee 12 or 15 times before I even have the nerve to drop the question. I'm getting better at it though, but
You don't
I'm
come
sure that
across that way at all, Ghazali. You seem so confident and you know how to work the room. I would never guess that.
it is. I think I just have a good. I can disguise it very well, I think. And also, what I've realized is that I'm much more confident in, how should I say it? Defending others or asking favors for others or asking for others than for myself. So yeah, so I'm when I'm in a room, I have no problem. UN, whatever, no problem. But when it comes to for myself, podcast or whatever, I get this whole like imposter syndrome like coming over me, like oh like I don't know like who am I, so I talk myself down. I did talk myself down often in the past, so hence the question actually that was it easy for you to ask people?
Yeah, and I think I've been thinking a bit about this. My spouse is also doing his PhD in business, and he is also Indigenous. He's Cree from northern Manitoba, and I don't have a PhD. I have a master's of law. I have 3 degrees, but none of which is a PhD. And so, while I'm in academia, and that's the path he's thinking, I can only give him so much help because I don't know some of the ins and outs. And so thinking a lot about imposter syndrome and my own sort of insecurities and things, and you think, where do these come from? Why can't we read the good messages, right? Why do I always have the self-doubt? But I realize there's so many times in the system that there's little things that knock on us, right? Like this isn't actually just our own insecurities. There's actually aspects of the system where people are constantly knocking us down, right? And the system itself, and unfortunately sometimes it's lateral violence or people who are just, the other thing I'm realizing is so many people are just themselves barely keeping their heads up, that they're just not able to reach out and help someone up because they're barely keeping themselves up, right? So I think it is really tough. There's been people that I've reached out to over the years that haven't given me any guidance or haven't been useful, or it's been a really negative experience, and it's been really hard, and I've taken it really hard. But 5 years, 10 years later, you get to know that person and you're like, oh, they didn't knock me down by not helping out. That person was also struggling, right? And they look like they have it all together, but we're all just sort of keeping, and then just the little knocks in the system, right? Like this promotion that you mentioned, I've fought really hard for it. I worked really hard for it, but there were people in my faculty that knocked me down, right? They called out, didn't think that I deserved it, and, questioned my publication record. And so there are people, right? So then that feeds into that sort of insecurity, right? When you've reached out to people, or when you get those really negative criticisms, or people that are saying you're not good enough, even when, you look at yourself and you look at others and you're like, well, I kind of feel like I'm doing it. And so I think there is a lot of systemic discrimination that sort of really feeds into that. So it's not just imposter syndrome of like insecurity, but I think how the system is built in a way to like feed into those insecurities, because it's not set up to help us, and that it does sort of knock us down in ways.
Yeah. Is it in a way, because you are familiar with the academic world. I'm only familiar with the the movement world, so to say. In my experience, it's almost like the movement is like a box of crabs, as in, like, if someone wants to try to climb out of it, others will pull you down. It is more like, if I do not have this opportunity, then nobody can have this opportunity. So, meaning, in a way, and that's every time, that's what I see, and that's what I observe in the movement. Is it the academic world? Have you heard about it, experienced it in a way similar, or am I just making things up in my head?
No, I think that happens, unfortunately, far too often in academia. And it's funny because, like, we're literally competing for nothing, right? So why wouldn't my colleagues want to support me and promote my work, right? I have a pretty broad audience, like, and so by building me up and promoting my work, doesn't that also bring more attention to the law school and to the other faculty members, right? Like, the more we can all get more attention, the better our law school is, which helps us all, right? And so people have talked about in academia that people are so cutthroat because the stakes are so low, right? Like, it's ridiculous to be fighting. I think there's also a lot of insecurities combined with a lot of ego, right?
Mm,
So often people who go into academia are very smart. Um, and also really privileged, right? And so um, there seems to be this need for people to be recognized as like the best, or um, and so yeah, and I think that when you have 20, 30, 50 of those people all working together, and if people are trying to fight, well, I'm the best, no, I'm the best, no, I'm the best, no, it can really hurt. But then there's just also insecurities, as you were saying, or this, like, I had to fight for it, you should have to fight for it, or that things have to be hard. And I think um, the other thing that's been really different for me is just relating back to culture and how I was raised. Like, I don't go around bragging about or boasting or talking about the work I do, right? Like, I just kind of have always been raised, you put your head down, you do the good work, and it's up to the community to decide if you're doing good work and to
mm,
compliment you, right? And that's not how this world is supposed to work. I'm supposed to be publicizing and promoting myself, and that's just not something that I'm good at or doing, and in part because that's not my culture, right? Like, I'm not supposed to be bragging. I'm raised to be humble, um and so, and I think the other thing that's been really different is just that um uh, me wanting to work in community and work, and not just in indigenous communities, but have a community around me, right? And
mm,
I work with a lot of people who are very individualistic, right? So kind of on that self. And so sometimes people are just out on their own agendas and not necessarily in a bad way, but everyone's just off doing their own thing, right? So then how
mhm.
do you sort of support one another when you're all doing your own work? So yeah, it can be really cutthroat. But I will say, I think there's increasingly an amazing community of Indigenous legal scholars in Canada and around the world. And, it's wonderful. I'm working with Claire Charters on a book project right now. And we've decided that one of our goals is to basically do a commentary on the UN declaration that's written almost entirely by Indigenous scholars, right? So we're not going to those, some of the early leaders in the field that were non-Indigenous scholars, but really making sure we're creating the space for young scholars to come and contribute. And um, so I do see more people, I think, making that effort to support
Mm.
junior people coming in. But yeah, I think academia itself can be ridiculously cutthroat, or the bucket of crabs, especially when, like, where are you going, right? Like, there's just um, there's no sort of limited resources that we're all fighting for or what have you, right?
Yeah.
It's not like in any given year they can only give promotion to 2 people, so you all need to scrum for those 2 positions, right? Anyone who applies and meets the standards gets promoted, right? We could all be promoted if we would support
Right.
each other.
You said something that has triggered my mind. Was super interesting. Was that apart from the people that you work with, because for people that don't know, you work with not only work with, you're friends with Megan Davis, Professor Megan Davis, amazing person, Professor James Anaya, Paul Joff, and then you also mentioned Dr. Claire Charters. These are one of amazing people within the movement that definitely enriched the movement in so many ways. You mentioned about creating your own community. How do you do that? But what is the Brenda Gunn special sauce that you pour over it?
I have no, I can be really strategic on like cases and working through things, but in my own life and career, I don't know. I think what I try to do, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who say I'm not successful or who have not positive things to say about me, but what I try to do is I really try to bring in people who are supportive, right? So latch on to the people who are supportive, um, and then provide that support to others, right? And it's hard because there can be that urge of like, no, I don't want to invite so and so to the meeting because I want it to be an exclusive club that I'm part of or something like that, right? So but to remember, no, when I was entering, I remember sort of feeling that need to sort of fight and claw my way into every meeting, and I don't want to be like that. Or especially when I started and the internet wasn't what it was, right? Like just sometimes even trying to find out where the caucus meetings were was such a challenge, right? Like that it was just, I always felt sometimes like it was this hidden secret, and whether it was a hidden group or just people, no one had the time to publicize, or me not knowing, where to find it. But like, um, yeah, so just remembering the struggles I had and trying to not make that. And remember that it doesn't have to be an exclusive club, right? Like that I can support foster. So where people turn and ask, for support, or where I can see people, I try to do that. And it's hard because I am, I think, a very shy person. I'm getting to realize as having a 2-year-old, you see yourself in a whole new light. Um, and realizing how shy I am. And so sometimes it's even really hard for me to reach out to someone I don't know who looks lost and say like, hey, are you lost? Are you looking for something? And it's not out of arrogance, but just my shyness and finding it hard to just talk to someone that I don't know, right? So yeah, I think that's where I try to work hard, is just like work with the people that I think are kind and supportive and are positive, and provide that to others as well.
Right. Yeah. Um. I love the how you describe it. As in, there's a level of empathy that I taste through the words that you want to, yeah. Despite your shyness, or you say that it's you're shy, but the underlying thing is that you want to help. Like you want people to be included, that they do know where the caucus is. Like even most of the times, I don't even know where the caucus is in UN meetings. It's always some people know, and then and usually I just find out by coincidence. But yeah, there's, like, in all honesty, like there should be more people like yourself within. I'm not saying that there are not people in the movement, but there should be more. Like I believe that there's, and for two reasons. One is that, like, solidarity is super important within Indigenous peoples around the world, but also, and and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. Is I get the feeling that because we talk about 476 million Indigenous peoples around the world, and those only a small percentage knows what's going on in the UN. Only a small percentage knows like has some knows the content or the articles of the declaration. And I think there should be a lot more people around the world should be aware of this.
Well, and I think, I have several responses to that. One is I, again, trying to be kind with others, and again, realizing sometimes I, felt like it was that exclusive club that you couldn't break into, or sort of knowing, but also remembering just how maxed out so many people are, right? So it's like, that lack of coordination of just like, where's the caucus? I mean, now it's usually easier because often at MREP, they'll announce the caucus's meeting if you stayed at the very end. If you're in the room at that moment, they'll sort of
Yes.
announce the room booking somewhere. So that's helpful. But remembering that sometimes people aren't being evasive purposely, but they may not know. And their intention is like right before that next, like they're focused on the task ahead of them. And then when they're done this, then they'll move on to the next task, which is finding where the caucus is. And they, they'll just ask around. And so recognizing that some people are just, really busy and are focused on sort of task. Oh, now I forgot the other point, and it was a more interesting one. Do you remember what you asked me?
So yeah, let me backtrack a little bit. Is so when it comes to support, empathy, but the last point that I was making is that there's only a few people that know about the declaration and know what's going on in the UN.
That was the second point that I thought. One of the things that I think that I view as having an obligation when I do work internationally is to bring it home, right? So I've always tried in my work to not just work internationally, like out there, but also to make sure that I'm bringing that work home. And so I've had the opportunity to work with the Council of Elders here in Manitoba, with the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. And, one of the things that I've ended up doing periodically when I'm invited to by the elders is I go in and I brief them on what's happening. So we have these meetings, and, I always come prepared, and I send them some materials like, like this is what's happening in the environmental and the climate change. They're starting this platform, and there's this stuff on participation. And I know the elders will be really interested about like making sure we're not NGOs. And so we talk about that. And this is what we're doing on the UN Declaration. And so I always go in prepared to brief them. And it almost never works out, because what they do is they'll be like, so I was back home and I heard so-and-so chief said she was going to the UN. What did she do? Because I don't know, they don't report back. And so then I'm finding out, it's like, oh, so-and-so was invited to the Commission on the Status of Women for the Women's Week meeting. And this is, so then you're sort of trying to prepare and off the top of your head, figure out who that person is, what meeting they attended, why they're doing that, right? And what the elders hear back home sometimes is just so-and-so went to the UN, right? Not, and so they just want to know. And so and the elders I work with sometimes have been concerned, right? Like, well, what are these people doing? What are they saying? How does that help us back at home? So I try really hard to make sure that the work I'm doing internationally is brought home and I'm sharing that information. So training sessions on the UN Declaration, right? Anytime I'm invited out to a community or to brief chiefs, I'm always happy to talk about that work. And I hope that if I'm briefing the chiefs are going home and sharing it with people. And so I think there, at least for me, I really see that as an important obligation, is to take that information that I'm, and the struggles and the work that we're doing internationally, make sure that our communities at home have access to that information.
Yeah, I think that is super important message to everyone that goes to the UN. Definitely go home and duplicate yourself, or like report back, because you do represent people or peoples. And the way that you describe like how you do it, because I do hear a lot of Indigenous people that went through the voluntary fund, for example, for the very first time to the UN, having difficulties explaining it, like, because you talk about legal, about legal stuff, the Declaration, Article 3, Article 18, Article 31, et cetera, and they have difficulties translating it to their chiefs or their community, so that they understand how whatever happens at the international level impacts them at the national level. Um, yeah, so I think, do you have a, like, what advice would you give to these people, in terms of, all right, they just went to the permanent forum, let's say a couple of years ago, because this year was obviously virtual, just flew back to, let's say, Nairobi, Kenya, and now what? And like, what would you advise that person to do in terms of translating whatever happened at the permanent forum or MRIP to community, and anything that you would, like, in terms of tactics or ideas that you could give?
One of the things that, at least at home, like has been interesting at various points to different groups is just learning what happened, right? Like, wow, so there's this UN, right? And what does the UN do, right? So like starting with the idea that every country in the world has one seat, and but then beyond that there's all these different works, and there's this body in permanent forum, and it works with the different, so just like straight up explaining the system, I think is really useful when you get home. And I think it's also really important to make sure that the voluntary fund is, God, I'm thinking corporate talk, onboarding, but making sure that and I think they're getting better and better at it, is making sure that when people show up, that they have the supports to figure out, especially the permanent forum. It is chaos, right? And I can't imagine ever showing up at the permanent forum by yourself for the first time. Like, just even figuring out how to get your freaking badge, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
so sharing any of that knowledge that you have on like what it was or what you did, and then just like what you did, what you saw, what you heard, right? So like, you know, um, hearing of the struggles around the world, I think sharing that information,
Mm.
reflecting on what you might do differently, how you might use the mechanism. Like, honestly, I still not sure I know how to effectively engage the permanent forum.
Right.
MRIP, I feel like I've got a good handle on, and really enjoyed that. But the forum is really big. And so, trying to think every time I go, it's like, why am I here? What am I trying to get out of this? Is this just another trip to New York? Well, I don't really just need to hang out in New York, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
so what am I trying to get? And whether it's the formal meeting or the informal meeting or the opportunities, like sometimes there's opportunities to meet with Canada at the permanent forum that's easier than it is to get at home,
Mm.
right? So sometimes in this ridiculous fashion, part of the goal is to sit down and have meetings with certain Canadian government delegations.
Right. Yeah.
You know,
I thank you so much for saying that, because, to make it, how should I put it, like the experience, explain the experience, because a lot of people think like when you go to the UN, that it's like you go into, and believe me, I got this from my community. It's like, well, did you meet the Secretary General, or like, were you in a meeting with that? When you go into a meeting, ask him these questions, or when do they send peacekeepers to our lands? So whereas it is much more, um, it's less clouds and more dirt, in terms of like, you need to get your badge all across this, like 2 blocks over,
yes.
at the permanent forum, stand in line for God knows how long.
And no
And
matter what hours they post, they're open or not the hours they're ever open.
yeah, definitely. And there's always a long line, and, it's and you can beat the crowd as far as you can beat the crowd by going on Sunday,
Sunday.
instead of going on Monday. Whereas you don't also want to go on. You don't want to go going late into the first meeting. It's at General Assembly Hall, blah blah blah. So all these experiences are super important as well. That the people know what's going on, what the UN is. That's not just, sitting behind a desk and like waiting for your 3 minutes, but it's much a lot more than that goes into it, even getting into the UN. And granted, working group on indigenous populations, that was like basically, and this is actually what Professor James and I said. I think it's a UNITAR training that I did, which was pre-declaration. And he said, well, yeah, well, for working group, yeah, you basically just needed a plane ticket to Geneva to get in, which was much more easy, less cumbersome to get in. However, the efficacy of a meeting is also super important, like you described. Like perform is. I agree. Like sometimes it feels like a circus, as in there's I'm not saying this in a way to say, like, to talk down on the decoration, not on the decoration, on the perform. However, I'm looking at the amount of people that do get in, go to the meeting, and the like what they get out of it. As in, like, for them, it's 3 minutes, it's gold. However, sitting in New York for 2 weeks for the 3 minutes, that's a lot of investment, and for you can get a lot more out of it. So it is, like what you explained just now about the perform or any UN meeting, like the work that you have to go through. I think that is also important, alongside like how the mandate of the perm forum or expert mechanism or the I don't know, CERT committee and on all these things. Yeah, it's you. Yeah, you went to Unitar, right? I think, like, not you, because I every time I go to a side event of Unitar, because I just support them, because I was one of the participants or trainees. There is the two photos that I always send out, one of you and one of Professor Megan Davis. I'm like, yeah, all right, these are the rock stars of the Unitar training.
I
Yeah,
had a
like
great year. I went with Alexi and the Nota and oh no, I'm forgetting his name. From Saba.
Atama?
Atama. Yeah, thank you. God, how could I forget his name? Sorry, I'm just bad with names and my brain is foggy. But yeah, so we had a great year. Rosalie was also there that year.
Wow.
Yeah, we had a really fun year.
That was a cohort. That's a cohort. That's so yeah. So for people that don't know about the Unitar training, could you like give you like the share experiences of what it was and how you like how you benefit. This sounds very corporate. Like, how did you benefit from
it? The funders report. How did they benefit?
Yeah.
So the Unitar program is a program that happens usually over a week, usually just outside of Geneva, that helps build peace building is, I think, what they call it, but like negotiation processes that I think can really enhance how Indigenous peoples engage in a lot of the diplomacy that they do. So thinking about how Indigenous peoples negotiate with governments, right? And the different tactics that people tend to rely on, and how those tactics don't always lead to successful or long-standing resolution. And so the process that they talk about and discuss is really meant to identify solutions that meet the underlying needs of all parties to come up with some sort of solution that can be lasting, right? So one of the lines that I remember is like, compromises, everyone's losing, right? And so is there a way to come up with a solution that actually meets everyone's needs, that can address the underlying problems and actually lead to better, longer standing peace or agreements? And so Yeah, I really took it was hard. I think most people who go through it, it's really challenging. It really, especially people who had been engaging in diplomacy and negotiations for a long time, learning a new way and being told that the way you're doing it is not a good way can be really hard to
Mm,
learn. But I have used, and I think one of the reasons why Trish often would ask me to present is I was able to use um, the training a bit in some of the work that I did in Manitoba on sort of trying to think about treaty implementation here. And so, working with some elders, talking about treaty implementation and how to sort of come up with strategies and approaches to implementing treaty that is perhaps different than what had been done over the last 150 years. And so
mm,
I think for me, the benefit is not just they teach you a sort of very set process for resolving problems that the UN tries to use. But I think beyond that process, there's a lot of tools and approaches that can be really useful, even how you identify the problem, right?
right.
Like, so how you talk about it. And just being really conscious of language that you're using and having discussions with people. And so, yeah.
'Cause you've been to the drafting process. You've been to the meeting, or like the draft declaration. Um, Now that you've also, like, when you were at the UNITA training, did um yeah, like when they talked about negotiations and everything else, did all of a sudden, like, did things make sense, and like in how the declaration
Yeah.
negotiation went?
Yeah, I only attended a very short period of time around 2004, which was a very interesting
Mm,
moment, right? So when I went the year that they had the double session, so there was the year that they were trying to finalize the chairperson's text.
mm-hmm,
And so there was the September and December meeting, I think. Um, and so it, there was, you know how most of the negotiations happen at that last 11th hour, that moment, and people get energized and there's movement. So
mm-hmm,
my experience, I think, was not necessarily reflective of the whole 30, 40-year process, because but it was a neat moment, right?
mm,
So particularly, because I live in Canada, one of the things that was really interesting, especially as things evolved in Canada, was I sat in on one of the small group on self-determination, and
mm,
Canada was actually leading a really fruitful discussion on self-determination, and Canada was supportive of it, right? And um, so it was just interesting to sort of see and have that experience. And then by the time we get to the General Assembly vote, we've got a change in government, and um, I you can see how Canada really changed from that moment to where they got to in the general vote. But yeah, I think the UNITAR training really does change how you see problems and resolutions and
mm,
how you approach them. But I think one of the things that continues to be difficult is we all have people behind us and how they expect us to carry on and engage in negotiations, right? And that view that you're being soft if you sort of engage in conversations, right? Sometimes there's still that perspective that you need to hold out, and that the real strength is in holding out and not in having conversation. And I tend to be more of the let's communicate, let's have a conversation, let's see what we can discuss. And
mm,
I have no intention of compromising and giving things away, but I do recognize that we're going to have a conversation, and that
yeah,
the solution may not look like the one that I came up with or what I thought I wanted to get out of the process.
right. You mentioned Canada, and also you've been in the declaration process. What we know now, that Bill C-15 is on the table right now. It's about, yeah, like, I'm not going to try to explain it because you're in a better position to do it, but it has to do with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Um, yeah, like, could you explain it for people that have no idea what's going on, and in a and I don't want you to butcher this, but in a shorter version, how it will benefit Indigenous peoples on the Canadian side.
Okay, well, I'm happy to do this. I have been presenting to the Canadian Parliament and the Senate. Those are our two representative institutions.
Hmm.
And so Bill C-15 is really simple. If you ever want to read legislation, this one is about 6 sections long, so 7 maybe. It's really easy. All C-15 does is say that the UN Declaration applies in Canada. It says that Canada should undertake a review of all its laws and policies to ensure they conform with the standards in the UN Declaration. It sets out a requirement to do a national action plan. And then it says Canada has to report back to Parliament in order to sort of say what they're doing. And then finally, it clarifies that nothing in implementing or nothing in C-15 can abrogate or derogate, which is take away or undermine or impact existing rights.
Mm.
So some people have said it's legislation about a plan to make a plan. But yeah, it's really just meant to help one, clarify, like when you're in litigation, Canadian courts have been terrible in using the UN Declaration. A lot of them, some have been really good, but a lot of Canadian lawyers and a lot of Canadian judges do not understand how international law applies. So I can point to several Canadian court decisions where judges have made errors in international law. Judges continue to talk about Canada ratifying the UN Declaration. And for those of you who know international law, knows that of course Canada hasn't ratified because they can't.
Mm.
There's nowhere to sign, there's nowhere to ratify.
Right.
Their only opportunity to affect the status of it in international law was at that General Assembly vote when they hit the red button, but they lost the vote, right? So,
yeah.
But a lot of people don't know that. And so, in theory, Bill C-15 should help address that. So now when lawyers want to cite the UN Declaration in litigation, they shouldn't have to prove how, that it applies in Canadian law or that it's relevant. That should be more accepted. I think also committing Canada to do a national action plan, right? Something that's coming out of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples is really
Correct.
significant, is really important. And then I think people underestimate the importance of the periodic reporting, especially like we know this at the UN. Like anytime a state has to publicly or pseudo publicly stand up and say, this is what we're doing, it really gives you that opportunity to challenge them. Right. And then sort of gives them some impetus to do something, right? If you have to, if you know you have to report in March next year on what you've done to implement the UN Declaration, by January, February, if you haven't done anything and you're trying to write the report, you're going to start moving. And it also gives then us opportunities, Indigenous advocates, to speak to the government. And of course, we can't take the floor in the House, but you can find members of the opposition or other MPs or members of Parliament to ask Canada some tough questions, right?
Mm.
And really hold their feet to the fire. And I think that's really significant because right now we don't have a way, right? So what we try to do is we try to do the international shaming, which is sort of effective, right? It definitely has its place of going to the UN and all of us calling out Canada for not doing anything. But if we can have more of that accountability and transparency, right? So actually knowing what Canada is doing, having them report is really important. So that's all that this bill really does, is it takes the UN Declaration, which exists out there, and gives us another avenue, a clearer avenue to begin implementing it in Canada.
Which is also super important, like it is, you have to breathe life into the declaration. It is, you cannot just refer to the declaration or reference it in meetings at the UN, perform MRIP, et cetera. Like you have to also bring it down to the national level, to the domestic level. So in that sense, it makes a lot of sense. Is there, to your knowledge, any process already ongoing in other countries that you would say like that's a good example of the declaration being become a part of the domestic law or
Yeah.
part of the discourse?
Yeah. Um, I'm really excited with what New Zealand is doing
Mm,
on sort of tracking implementation and working to implement the UN Declaration. You know, the work, of course, of Tracy Farr and others.
yeah.
I think that work is really inspired. Um, I love it. I think about, you know, sometimes when I'm up at night trying to, you know, I think about how do you take a process like that and apply it in Canada? We are significantly larger and more diverse, right? So I
Yeah.
think um, those sort of community-led processes nationally would be really challenging, but I think there's a lot that we can learn from there. Um, I think um, the clarification that we're getting in some of the Latin American context, just of how it applies, is important. I'm afraid that it might be um, statements of support and application in law in rhetoric only. I don't know how much effect it's having. But again, they're all just tools, right? Like, no government is going to easily change their mind. And I think it is tough to know what's happening, but I think every tool we have, we just have to make sure we can become experts in using it and really in really taking advantage of the opportunity that it gives us. So
Mm,
um, I think statements where it's, you know, through whatever process where we say that it applies in domestic law is really useful, because you know it makes it easier to use the UN Declaration domestically then.
hmm yeah, so people know, you referenced New Zealand, and what Tracy Farr is working on is the, should say correctly, the iwi chairs forum, independent monitoring mechanism on the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Doing a great job. And what they also do, Brenda, you can very much attest to that as well, is that every year they go to the MRIP and they also provide a report. So it's not just the state that does it, but also the monitoring mechanism, independent, led by Indigenous peoples. They assess like how the declaration is being implemented, and they report back to the UN. So it is not just, no, sorry, I should rephrase that. I think it is a very good initiative, and I think that Indigenous people should be doing that a lot more around the world. And I think that is because it's the way that I see it is also part of self-determination. As in, like, all right, we have our rights. We'll set up our own monitoring mechanism. If that is, obviously, Canada is a much more bigger country than New Zealand. You have Metis, Inuit, and First Nations, but but it is something that, yeah, it can very much help the advance the implementation on the rights of Indigenous peoples in any country.
Yeah, and if I could just
Yeah.
jump in there, I think one of the important things and one of the reasons that I really like that approach is a lot of the advocacy that I see is Indigenous peoples trying to get the government to do things. And it is their responsibility and their obligation. But I also think there's a lot more we could do ourselves, right? And monitoring implementation, for example, is something that we may not want the government to self-report. If we think of the treaty monitoring bodies and the periodic reporting, right? If you look at the shadow NGO reports versus the state report, you come up with very different ideas of how different countries are working to implement their treaty obligations. So I think in the same with the UN Declaration, right? Like, we keep hammering for states to implement, states to do this, and it's like, well, but I think we can do a lot. And I think also my understanding is, I think that the implementation work that was started with the iwi chairs has been really critical to the process to doing a national action plan in New Zealand, right? So once they started doing that work to monitor implementation, um, it really then, I think, encouraged the government to start doing more to create a national action plan to implement. And I think they're doing some really good stuff there in New
Mm,
Zealand as well. Um, I haven't been following it as much as I would have liked to, but I think you can just sort of see how that taking it into your hands and doing it yourself has had some big impact.
Right. Yeah. So we're C15. Where are we at? Where is it right now? Is it making any progress?
I think so.
Mhm.
So this, of course, is the second time that Canada has tried to pass legislation that is somewhat implementing the UN Declaration, of course.
Mm.
In the early 2010s, 15s, we had the Cree Member of Parliament, Romeo Saganash's Bill C-262. And that, of course, was killed by the Canadian Senate in June 2019. And so now what we've done is we have the actual government in power, the Liberal government, introduce legislation. So a private member bill means someone who is member of a party who's not the government in power. So Romeo was an NDP member of parliament, and
Mhm.
now we have the Liberal government introducing legislation. And so it's passed the House. So it went through first reading, second reading, committee, third reading, vote, passed. Then it goes to our second House, which is the Senate, which is an appointed body, not an elected body. And it's made it through first reading and second reading, and now it's being studied by the Aboriginal Peoples Committee. And I think I heard they have 10 days of study that they've set out. So it started, maybe it was, what day is it? I think the hope is that they'll finish the study by end of May and vote
Mm.
on it ideally by end of May. And if they do, then it passes, unless one of the things is if the Senate proposes a lot of changes or does changes, then it may need to go back to the House again. But we are basically just about at the same place where we were when it was killed last time. Some people say it died, but I think that there were some people in our Senate who worked very hard to actively make sure it didn't pass. So I don't think it just sort of, oops, it died. It was attacked very strategically by certain members of the
Right.
Senate. So so I think I haven't been following the exact numbers, but I think the government is optimistic that it'll pass
Mm.
through the Senate. But
Yeah.
there's been some challenges this time.
Hopefully it will get more support from Indigenous peoples in Canada. It's obviously I don't know like how the situation is at the moment, but you always see around the world actually there's people that are opposed. No, sorry, I should say it differently. There's a lot of misconceptions about legislation like these, as well as a declaration out there, that hopefully that through advancing the discourse, advancing this conversation about it, that these misconceptions can be taken away. And I think that is, people rely, they base their opinions about it based on these misconceptions, which is, I think would not, which is plainly wrong. I try to come up with a very diplomatic way of saying it, but it's just wrong to base any opinion based on a misconception. Is that what's going on right now? Is it? Can you sense that?
I think it's hard to sort of fully. I mean, I don't want to oversimplify. I think
Sure.
the range of opposition that we're hearing from grassroots people ranges. I think some definitely are based on some misunderstandings of what the bill does and what it will or won't do. Some sort of legitimate concerns about how Indigenous peoples were participating in the process of drafting, right? So a lot of people are really expressing opposition to the bill because they believe the standard for any new legislation related to Indigenous peoples is co-drafting. and this bill wasn't co-drafted, right? Was drafted. Um, and I can understand where people are saying the government misstepped, that they needed to consult Indigenous peoples more robustly than they did. Canada focused on the national Indigenous organizations,
Mhm.
AFN, MNC, ITK, the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit national organizations. And I think the response would be that Canada relied on the fact that this bill was originally drafted by a Cree man who did extensive consultations coast to coast to coast. And any changes really that Canada did introduce between Bill C-262 and C-15 was related to, or it was resulting from some of the negotiations and discussions they had before introducing the bill.
Mhm.
And so what I have sort of said to the Senate most recently is that I think we want to remember that consultation is not a moment in time. So we might be concerned with how the government introduced this bill or the amount of consultation, but consultation, we didn't lose that opportunity, right? That we need to continue to insist that Canada engages Indigenous peoples through this whole process, including if the bill passes in development of the National Action Plan, right? So
Mm.
under international law, under the UN Declaration, consultation is not like, we're going to pass this bill, what are your thoughts? Okay, we're moving on. Indigenous peoples need to be engaged in that whole process. And even the bill itself talks about engaging Indigenous peoples in the National Action Plan, and Indigenous people should be engaged in the review of law and policies, and Indigenous peoples themselves should be doing those reviews of laws and policies, right? So I think we also want to make sure that the engagement of Indigenous peoples, we don't just say they didn't do enough in the past. We want to really push that they have this obligation through the whole process of passing the bill and implementing the bill
Mm.
if it becomes legislation. There's been some confusion over the non-derogation clause, which is the provision that says nothing in the act can take away from or negatively impact existing rights. Some people have taken some interpretations of the provision that I don't see when I read it, and I have a hard time sort of understanding those positions,
Mm.
particularly because when you read the legislation, it says you can't, implementing the UN, that this legislation that's implementing the UN Declaration can't take away from existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. And when you read that with the UN Declaration that says that the Declaration says nothing in this Declaration can be used to take away from existing existing rights, including treaty rights, it becomes really hard to understand how you could in any way interpret legislation implementing the UN Declaration as undermining existing rights.
Mm.
That's not to say that Canada won't try. I don't have a lot of confidence in our government in the best times. They might try to, take interpretations that we don't think are in line with the spirit of the UN Declaration or the actual standards in the Declaration, right? But then it just comes back to us to not let them get away with that. So I think some interpretations there that I'm not, that I don't see.
Mhm.
Someone I know has expressed concerns over the bill. And this person has sort of said that they think the whole UN Declaration and this bill is a distraction, that we should just be focusing on inherent rights and focusing more on treaties.
Mhm.
And I can respect that, right? That's a strategy. I think the UN Declaration is a tool, it's grounded in inherent rights. And so I think it's a useful tool to realizing and gaining recognition of inherent rights. But if you don't think it is, and if you think all the time and effort that's being put into passing this legislation is distracting from the actual work of just implementing the rights, I mean, agree to disagree on that one, right? Like I mean, I'm not going to tell you that this is the right way to implement or to go about, but I think it's a useful tool, so I support it.
Right.
Um, there's been some of the things that are a bit more concerning is we're hearing some disagreements now that sort of talk about being against the bill, but are somehow against the UN Declaration now.
Mm.
So we're hearing renewed concerns in some areas over Article 46, right? So, and that, I find that disheartening and or frustrating. When Canada voted against the UN Declaration, there were many people who were also then, and Indigenous peoples in Canada who were against the declaration, that thought it wasn't useful. And many of us did years of education and training and listening and talking about some of the value that might be in the UN Declaration. And I thought we had gotten over that, right? Like, I thought we now that most people were on board. And so then it's like, well, I don't know. So I've been, doing as best I can, some more education on Article 46, right? That the basic idea in international law is that a state's territorial integrity and political unity is only guaranteed to the extent that they uphold right of self-determination, right? Article 46 isn't a standalone, right? Like, states don't have a right to territorial integrity and political unity, full stop.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They have to uphold people's rights to self-determination if they want to have their right to territorial integrity and political unity respected. The converse of that being, if self-determination is not fulfilled in Canada, then Canada, does not have an absolute right to territorial integrity and political unity, right? And so I don't think that implementing the UN Declaration or the mechanism of Bill C-15 does anything to undermine Indigenous people's sovereignty. It's basically, Bill C-15 should be read as Canada taking steps to implement its obligations that are recognized in the UN Declaration. Right? And so I don't think it's undermining Indigenous people's sovereignty or self-determination in any way, but just another tool to implement it.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think one of the I don't know if it's a criticisms, but ITK, the National Inuit Organization, has again been pressing for an Indigenous Rights Commission. So they want an independent body that can actually hear complaints over Indigenous people's rights, that we're not just going to the Canadian courts.
Mm-hmm.
So some people have responded like, yes, that's a great idea, but we don't need that in the legislation, that could be something that goes into the National Action Plan. So I am tracking that because I think it is a great idea. At this point in time, I don't know whether we need to hold up this legislation for not including it or not. But I do think that's something that, if this passes, must be considered in the National Action Plan, right? That implementation component and enforcement of rights has to be part of the National Action Plan, and hopefully something like an Indigenous Rights Commission would go in there. So I think, the concerns, and some, there's some national political organizations that are expressing concerns about whether implementation is going to, for example, I understand the Native Women's Association of Canada is again expressing concerns about their role and the role for Indigenous women in the implementation, including will they get a fair share of funding? And I think those are real issues and things we want to be alive to. Do we need to kill this bill in order to address those? I'm not sure. I think those are really valid concerns we want to continue to track and make sure we're addressing, that Indigenous women do in fact benefit from the implementation of the UN Declaration and this bill.
Right. Thank you so much for outlining and the misconceptions that are out there, at least to your knowledge in a way, and then also commenting on them. I think that's super important. That that there's also there's some analysis and there's some reflection on how people think about things. So, but it looks of it, and I fully agree with you. It is not the end all be all, but it is a tool. It is an opportunity. Like you describe how Bill C-15 is. So I'm very much looking forward to having a follow-up discussion with this. I know you don't have a lot of time left because you're super busy, so I won't keep you
I
too
have a
long.
book launch that I have
Yeah.
to work on a
So
presentation for in 40 minutes.
yeah. So I just two final questions, which is more about you as a person. One is like, what would you like to see in terms of like down the line, end of the road? What is Brenda Gunn's big, hairy, audacious goal?
Yeah. You know, that's always part of, I think, one of the tough questions. It should be an easy one, but it's not always. So I have a 2-year-old little girl who was born in December of 2018. January 1st, 2018, my brother-in-law took his life. And it's a really grounding experience, right? So I really hope that my little girl grows up in a world, in a family, in a community where she doesn't continue to experience intergenerational trauma, residential schools of the assimilation policies in Canada. And so for me, I think that's one of the big things, is really thinking about what her life will look like, right? So will she have the opportunity to learn her Indigenous languages, right? We live in an urban center in Canada. There's not at this point a lot of language opportunities for Indigenous students in all areas of Winnipeg. There's definitely some schools that are doing some amazing things. Those are not the catchments that we currently live in. So, will she, as it gets to be summertime and her skin very quickly turns from light brown to a much darker brown, right? How will she be seen in Winnipeg? We, of course, in Canada have an ongoing genocide against Indigenous women. And so I have a young Indigenous woman, and I wonder what her life will hold. And, that is never lost on me, but I hope she's never one of those numbers. And so, I think for me, I think these were the things that I was probably always fighting for, but they've come to light in a whole different way because there's literally a person there whose life I'm fighting for every day to try to make sure that she's having a good life and gets all the positive experiences. And she had the opportunity to meet the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples when she was 2 months. And, how much will her life be surrounded by these political struggles? Will her, is her life going to be continuing on, or will we, is it going to be the same struggles and fights that her dad and I have done, or will there be different things, or will she be, just able to live the good life, or will she be still fighting for it? I don't know.
Right. If you could go back in time and could tell your 10-year-old self anything, what would it be?
Wow, ending on the hard questions. I thought we were supposed to get easier as we went along. My 10-year-old self. I think to come back to where we started is just having the confidence and continuing to find my voice. I'm very happy. I think I'm very close to having found my voice. It still gets taken from me. I was I was asked to present to the Canadian Senate with a Canadian academic who has very loudly advocated against Indigenous people's rights, in particular the rights of Métis people. And as a Métis woman, it was really challenging to sit on a panel on a bill on the UN Declaration with someone who doesn't think I should exist, or that that I'm real, or and should have any rights. And so it was hard. I was I think I was shakier than I've ever been in any of my presentations to the Canadian government. And it was kind of shocking how nervous I was to just sit beside. I guess we could say a known racist, right? What else is there to say about something, right? But like just that sort of violence that is, right? When you're asked to sit with someone and feel like part of you needs to just defend your even existence, right? Even when you're asked to speak to a bill, you kind of feel undermined. So I think to just keep trying to find my voice and use my voice when I can and where I can. And yeah, I don't know. 10-year-old Brenda was even quieter and even shyer. And last night, Pete and I were talking about, we were watching some Netflix show, and it had teenage girls, right? And the thought of raising a teenage girl, those years are so hard. The 10-year-old me, I'm not as worried about as like the 13-year-old, 15-year-old, 16-year-old Brenda. The choices I made are things I think I made out of insecurity and just that wanting a sense of a place and belonging and fitting in and having friends and connecting. And I think that just has always sort of struggled and sort of just trying to, you'll find your place in the world, and but maybe that's advice I need to keep hearing today. I don't know.
Well, in my book, you found your voice. I very much look up to you as not only as a friend, but also as a professor, as an Indigenous woman. It is just a podcast, but I'm super humbled and privileged to have you in this conversation. And you're a super busy woman. Your partner is an amazing guy, also a very good photographer. I'm super envious of the photos that he makes, and your daughter is nothing short of amazing. So you're doing a very great job, Brenda, and everything that you do. So I'll let you go now, because you have a difficult, not difficult, but like a lot of things to prepare for. And whenever you have time, I'd love to unpack more about your work and everything you do. But again, whenever you have time.
Sure. Maybe next month we can continue the conversation. And just thank you so much, Casali, for having me. I was really honored when you asked me to participate, and I'm very happy to have found some time to sit with you today and to answer some hard questions.
Sorry about the last ones.
That's okay. They're almost emotional, when you think about just where you got to, and finding the voice and keeping the voice and not letting people take that voice, I think is something that we all continue to work with. So thank you very much for all of your time and your questions. And I look forward to continuing the conversation again someday soon.
Yeah, same here. And so I'll let you go. Have a great day. Have a great day, and good luck with your presentation later on today.
Yeah, I feel like it's just on a book chapter I've written. I should be able to talk for 10 minutes about something I've already written, right? It shouldn't be that hard, but it's
you'll be all right. You'll be all right. You'll do fine.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks, and it's so nice to see you again. Take care, Casali.